Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Dr. Paul, it's great to be with you today.
Good. We're going to be talking about this famous president we have. He's a good businessman. He plans for the future. He finds good deals, and he finds out that if he buys 40 million, I'm just joking, maybe there could be that many, of these vaccines, he will be able to use them all because he said that the kids need these injections. Anybody between 5 and 11, they have to have these injections. But it hasn't been fully tested yet. But he bought the vaccine anyway, just in case, it gets approval from the FDA and the CDC. But I would say that he has some inside information there, But just think of a businessman doing this, buying something like this where you haven't tested it, and then what if there had been really liability with it? People wouldn't be doing this if they were responsible. But under these circumstances, it's all taxpayers' money. It's all liability that doesn't fall on the companies anymore. It all falls on the innocent people. All falls on the taxpayers. And this is good news, as far as the liberals go, and that people are cheering on us, almost all the people, because guess what? People are waking up, and the numbers of people who are saying enough, we don't need any more of this, and we're not going to take it. But this is the plan that's going on, and of course we won't be able to deal with all the possibility of the downside of this, but there's taxpayers downside, costs going down, health people don't know about, how much might the kids suffer, how much of this will be just ripping off on their civil liberties, because once again, it'll be used as blackmail. If you don't have your certificate, if you don't have your passport, you might not get to go to play the football games and all. Even though every day, practically, Chris, we've been reporting on people resisting. So there's a contest going on there. But I think this is another good point where they haven't given up. They being the people who are in charge of wasting the money and pretending that they care about the kids, and therefore they have to give everybody a shot real soon. So we want to visit a little bit with that. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Paul, when I saw purchased for every child 5 to 11 years old, the first thought that came to my mind is why? I mean, we know that the children are 99.99, whatever the statistic is, it's absurd, safe from COVID. Why would every child in America even need the vaccine? So I thought to myself, and I looked it up, about 75% of Americans own smartphones. What if Biden said, I just bought a smartphone for every American, in America? The first question would be, why? What a waste. We all have smartphones. So it makes no sense. Excuse me. And we see that a massive amount of adults have refused. They're not going to get this vaccine. I think it's safe to say that they're not going to get it for their children too. So to purchase enough for every child 5 to 11 makes no sense unless, like you said, Dr. Paul, you factor in that this is cronyism, crony capitalism. The vaccine makers, I'm sure, are tickled pink. Can you have easier money than this? Sell it to the government for every child, whether they need it or not, want it or not. So yeah, this is a very ugly situation. Boy, would we be so much better off if we had free markets and capitalism in this country versus what we have today.
Yeah, I was saying, and Biden is begging and pleading for cooperation. Don't resist. That's not nice. And if you resist, you're the bad guy. And I get to thinking, what if the parents do look into this a little bit, which they have, and find out indeed the child is in much greater danger by taking this thing. But they've already labeled people who are resisting as terrorists, and the parents are going to get into trouble, and the kids will get labeled as not protected, and this is their whole goal is to control. So this is something I think is such a disaster for the way things should be done. It's not like we're abandoning the children. It's the way it's being done and the enhancing of the political power, and then you get the politicians involved in like this, and then all of a a sudden you get the mixture of the politicians and their political power that they want to exert, along with a few pharmaceutical companies that would like to make profits. And the one thing that I've mentioned many times that really bugs me is they were able to manipulate the Congress to exempt them, from liability. That is the free market way of placing more caution on what the people are being sold. If you're selling people new products, you can't just promise there are no complications. If there are, the government's going to take care of it. I mean, this to me is in so many things, it's the guarantee by government. That's this idea of government insurance, whether it's flood insurance or retirement insurance or whatever. It's not insurance. It has to do with pre-planned bailouts, and that's what they're doing. So this is a whole thing of deception, and there's a lot of money involved. And of course, the bottom line still for me is, I wonder what it's going to do to the kids. Already we have known, with this modest attempt, this is a radical attempt, the modest attempt to have depressed a lot of the kids. There's been an increase in suicides among children, and there's going to be the psychological effect on them, but also just from my experience, which I wouldn't brag about being excessive, but having remembered and dealt with vaccines to some degree, that you don't know about what the result will be when you give the vaccine this week. Oh, next week it might not have affected anybody, and it's been okay. So this is the whole thing, is the effect of the vaccine may last week, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the tragedy is something that I've but mentioned before, is they have it worked out where if you get a vaccine and you have a complication, a week afterwards, it's exempt. You're not considered vaccinated until you receive your booster shot, which could be 28 days from the very first one you got. Otherwise, you're not even considered vaccinated. So any type of complication for those first couple weeks, they don't even mark them down. They don't count. And can you imagine, how much won't be marked down? That's why if the market's working and there's responsibility placed on the people who are selling stuff and making profits, instead of using taxpayers' money and ripping the taxpayers off, this would make a big difference. But this could get much worse, and let's just hope the resistance keeps building. It's risky too. If you're involved at a school board meeting and you're promoting this, the Attorney General is going to come after you. For being involved in this. And of course, he won't say, well, my daughter-in-law has to be taken care of. She sells this stuff. So we have to protect her marketplace. This is a business deal for us. But that's not going to be the attitude, but I think that's the attitude that some people should look at.
Right, Dr. Paul. And, you're right to bring up that we do not know, good or bad, what comes of this stuff, because there have been no long-term tests, because there has been no long-term in this debacle. We don't know tomorrow, a year from now, 5, 10 years, don't know. Now, it is understandable that someone in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they may think to themselves, I'm not really worried about the long-term due to my age. It makes sense. I'm in the vulnerable category. I'm willing to take the risk. That makes sense. But for a kid who has their whole life ahead of them, that's a whole different calculation. And everyone has absolved themselves. There's no pointing fingers at anybody if something goes wrong. And, you have to feel for parents, because they are going to make decisions for young ones who have no idea about what is going on. They don't know anything about this stuff, especially if you're 5, 6, 10 years old. What happens when they are old enough to realize, and they possibly come back to you and say, Mom, Dad, I had a 99.9% chance of being okay from COVID. There were no long-term tests, and you let them do this? I mean, how are you going to explain yourself out of that? So parents are going to really have to think. Now, the propaganda does not want you to think it's all just push, propagandize you and try to make you feel pressure. But you better use your brains, because this is a big, big decision that has to be made.
You know, there was an article out just yesterday, I think it was, that a quarter of the football players being the soccer players in Europe, said that they're not going to get inoculated. They have some, they've had the first shot, but they're not going to continue. They're tired of it all, and they're going to resist. So there's more of that all the time. And of course, we complained a lot about how weak the resistance had been in places like Australia, and yet they're starting to wake up too and show some resistance. You know, when I think of the big picture here, I think of the distortion about the president when he announces these things, and when the members of Congress come in, and the FTC, FDA, and the CDC come out and make these pronouncements, and they say, and they give you statistics like they know exactly the truth. And therefore, anything you disagree with them on is you are a conspirator, you're a terrorist, and yet they are pretending, of course, that they are the source of truth. And I keep thinking about this because, the whole principle of cultural Marxism is the true Marxist gives up the pretense that truth can be known. Truth can't be known according to the Marxists. There's no higher order, and yet they're working on this whole thing. When you look at the far left and the people who work with the culture of Marxism are always demanding that we have the absolute final proof on the vaccines and what is going to happen, by people who don't even believe you can decide what the truth is. But that's a political thing that they go with. That is why you don't want to get a bunch of politicians pretending that they can seek out and pronounce what is the truth. That is something that people have been searching for centuries, and there's all different ways. It's not easy, but it isn't done by all of a sudden being people pronouncing that science is what we follow. And if you don't follow science, you're defying the truth. You're just a bunch of fools, and yet they get away with that. But Chris, I happen to believe less so now than they did a year ago.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And I'll try to finish with my closing statement as on a more positive note. I'll try, at least. I'm going to go to our great Declaration of Independence. What an amazing document that was. And this is what you'll find in it, in part. It says, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So in other words, people will suffer. They will put up with tyranny. And we now have living proof of that just by looking at the last several years. It's unprecedented tyranny, where people have covered their faces, locked in their homes, businesses destroyed, churches closed, amazingly. So, but there is a kind of a silver lining. It says there, while evils are sufferable, which means there's always a breaking point. There's always a point where people will not suffer anymore. And we may be starting to see those green shoots, with pilots, with police unions, resistance, with athletes like the NBA player Kyrie Irving. He's got millions, tens of millions on the line, and he's not getting the shot, no matter how many millions, because he values his freedom. We see every weekend, may not see it on our media, but if you go out there on the internet and look, you will find that there are massive protests all over Europe every single weekend. So there comes a time for everyone, and it's different for everyone, where that's it. It's too far. We can't be pushed any further. And that line is different for all of us. But parents are going to have to face this, because if Biden bought all these vaccines, they're going to want to use them, and parents are going to have to decide, is this too far?
Very, very good, Chris. And I want to finish up by talking about some of the big things that cause people to accept the conditions that we have today. Because nobody wants to deliberately say, well, I have to accept this because this is the best thing for me. But I think the tool that they use, and we've talked about this a whole lot, is that people have to be made fearful, scared to death, and it's out of their control. They can't do anything about it, and they have to listen to the politicians and the promises that they can take care of them, and they want the safety and the security of government. And if you don't accept that, you're going to live in great danger. Or the other thing is you'll be unpatriotic. So how often have they used so far that even to the point of almost literally blaming the president. The president is causing deaths because he didn't say such and such. And you have to go along with it, or a position that is in disagreement with the far left and this Marxism stuff will lead to somebody dying, and you'll be responsible and you'll be liable for it. So to be patriotic is a goal. People want to have that, and it takes a long time for them to wake up. But what happens is when a new society develops and they emphasize liberty, as we did a couple hundred years ago, the important issue there was responsibility. Who's responsible for taking care of themselves? Did they sit down and say, what kind of a government we have to make everybody perfectly safe, make sure that they never have a want to worry about, make sure they have medical care and food to eat and travel, and they can do whatever they want? No, that is not what it is. They talked about their freedom. The freedom to make their own decisions and take their own risk. And right now, people have been willing in these last 2 years to say this is really, really bad. And yet when you dig through all this, just like on these kids, it's not quite that bad. Like Chris has pointed out, what is the percentage of a kid, dying from this stuff? Less than 0.5%, and yet they're willing to plan to give a shot to everybody without even knowing the potential danger of taking the vaccine. And in a free society, the individual really makes the decision that they themselves will take the risk that exists. And that is something that is hard for people to understand. And they're way too tolerant of the false promises. But right now, I would think that people are waking up. They're getting more questioning of the government now. And of course, this is the reason those of us who would suggest you have a right and an obligation to question what your government is doing, that they have to make it turn those individuals into the problem. And this is the whole thing is in a free society, people are responsible for it. But also, you're supposed to benefit tremendously from your freedom. You're not supposed to have to sacrifice anything. You should have the motivation to do what you think is best for your health, and consult the people that you want to consult with, and not depend on the politicians, the bureaucrats, the lobbyists, and all the individuals who have all these false promises with threats. Now it's this cancel culture. If you don't do what you say, and that still exists, and that's why no matter what they say, no matter what this concession has been in these last month or two, because they've had to make them because they're really following a silly program. What they're saying is that we can't do this any longer because the people are waking up, and that I think is important, that the people wake up and finally say that they have to assume responsibility for themselves, and that's what a free society is all about. Now, the magnificent thing about all this is they say, oh my goodness, I won't get free medical care, I won't get free this, I won't get this. Yes, just look, we get free vaccines that might be hurting us more than helping us, but nothing is free because it all comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. So people have to understand how it operates, and you have to decide what the government wants. The fantastic thing about a free society is that it's the most prosperous and safest society conceivable. It is the greatest chance of having peace and prosperity if people themselves understand the principles of liberty and not the principles of authoritarianism, where you can gang up and take liberty away from somebody else to benefit yourself through the political process. So it's a major problem, but it's not that difficult to understand. And right now the opportunity is, because it's getting readily apparent that the government is failing at most of this, and this failure of government is going to get much, much worse, because a lot of things have to be resolved, not only this lockdown and the COVID problem, but also the consequence of runaway inflation. That has to be resolved, but it also gives people an opportunity to say, well, was there a better way that we could have done this? You know, it's pretty neat getting checks all the time from the government, which is an argument you have to be able to make, because obviously that was just false promises, and we're suffering the consequences from that now. Because the major thing right now is, by golly, prices are going up. I can't buy my groceries anymore. When's the government going to send me another check? Well, it's not going to work that way. We need to wake up people to find out it's this dependency on government, dependency on printing press money, and the promises, the fake promises of the politicians. Don't sweat it. We're here, and we're going to take care of you. But I think there's a much better way to protect peace and prosperity, and I want to urge you to please return to the Liberty Committee and come back and visit us on this whole issue of peace and prosperity.